to Logical, the UAE's first and still the only regular legal podcast. My name's Tim Elliott. As always, here's our expert, the managing partner of the Dubai-based legal firm, HPL Yamalova and Plethka here in Dubai. Ludmila Yamalova, nice to see you.
Great to see you too, Tim, as always.
Now, this is a special episode of Logical, and we're also very pleased to welcome a special guest. Now, this is a recent mother of a baby boy who's just turned a year old, who was born in Dubai. Mother and baby are both full-time residents of the UAE. Now, I should say before we start, in the interests of protecting the privacy of both mother and child, we've changed their names. And it's a fascinating story, and a story in significant part written by Ludmila's team. It's a real-life case in which Ludmila and her team represented and fought for, using creative, persuasive and persistent techniques, and challenged various UAE authorities on the application of the country's, as we've talked many times about, Ludmila, rapidly evolving and sometimes fundamentally novel laws. Now, I'm going to turn to you. What are we talking about today?
Yes, so it's a very interesting case regarding birth certificates and issuance of the birth certificates in Dubai for babies with unknown fathers in particular. Today, with our special guest, we'll discuss a real-life case involving a mother in Dubai who gave birth to a baby who had been conceived through IVF and the challenges she experienced in issuance of the birth certificate for her baby. In discussing her case, we will naturally go over the legal framework for issuance of birth certificates in the UAE and also analyze the application of those laws as compared to the actual process, which in this particular case the mother went through. This is a case which is both legally interesting and emotionally rather heart-wrenching. In a case of a baby who was first born and for quite some time was without a birth certificate, and then a baby who was named by someone other than his mother. And to hear the full story and the ultimate results, listen to the rest of this discussion. So it's a bit of a cliffhanger.
It really is. Let's meet Mum. So, Lindsay, nice to meet you.
Hi, Tim. Nice to meet you too.
Good to have you here. Now, to the extent that you feel comfortable, share a little bit of your story. Tell us about yourself, where you're from, where you live, what you do, shoe size, and all the important stuff that we need to know. But also in that, how did you find Ludmila and her firm, and why did you reach out to them to begin with?
Okay, sure. So I'm from the UK, and I've actually been living in Dubai for over 12 years now. I reached out to Ludmila actually when I decided to go ahead with trying for a baby via IVF. The laws were very different then. It was a couple of years ago, and they were changing as I became pregnant. So I reached out to Ludmila and the team as a consultation, really, to understand what my options were to decide whether I needed to go back home to the UK to give birth or whether I could stay here. So I did do some research around my options. I spoke to Ludmila and the team, and I listened to the podcast.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a resident here in Dubai. You've lived here for, 12 years. You work in the corporate world in Dubai.
Yes,
You're a professional working mum, as it were.
And you're not married, because that's the key. You're not married, and you're a non-Muslim, which for the purposes of this discussion and the progress of your life story, those factors are fairly relevant, and we will soon find out why. And you decided to have a baby on your own, obviously while living in the UAE, which was for many years actually not possible. For a single mother to have a baby and for that baby to be born here. So when do you remember exactly around what time you decided you start thinking about the idea of being a single mom? Just because in terms of the timeline, the historical timeline, and how the laws evolved, it would be interesting.
So it was just after COVID. Well, it was during COVID that I actually started the process. So it was early 2021 where I started looking into my options. I started by freezing my eggs, and then decided to go ahead with trying for a baby on my own. I did actually, because at that time it was, as far as I was aware, it was illegal to be pregnant in the UAE or to give birth in the UAE unmarried. I actually did the IVF in Greece, and I used I had an anonymous donor via a bank, a sperm bank from Denmark. So the process was all outside of UAE, and I was planning to remain in the UAE for as much as my pregnancy as I could, while I worked out what my options were about giving, where I could give birth. And
when did you finally get pregnant, and when was the baby supposed to arrive?
So I did my successful round in 2022, mid-2022. So, and my son was due February last year, February 2023.
Okay, well, congratulations, because he's now a year old. And he's walking.
Already, yes.
Okay, so life's changed for you forever.
I know.
Now he's off.
Very much mobile, yes. I know it.
So let's just jump back ever so slightly. Where did you want to give birth? Which country? And where did you end up giving birth?
Yeah, I really wanted to stay here because, I've been living here a long time. I'm everything, this is my home. Even from a convenience factor, if I'd have needed to leave the country to give birth, I'd have had to have left at least a month earlier. I wanted to work as much as possible up until my due date. I would have had to come back with a young baby. I've been here a long time. I've got pets here. What would I have done with my pets? I needed to move house right before I gave birth. All those. It was more convenient for me to be able to stay here and to have a newborn baby in my own home rather than to have to go somewhere else.
And so at that time, what did you know about the UAE laws in terms of your ability or inability, for that matter, to have a baby on your own? And how did you learn about what the legal framework was at play at the time?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, when I first started the process, I was thinking, I thought I would need to go home, and I was going to cross that path when it came to it. By the time I actually got pregnant, I had heard via various Facebook groups or conversations I'd seen that the laws had changed and it was now possible to give birth unmarried. So I was aware of that. I just wasn't as sure about the step of being single. I knew, okay, if I'd had a partner and been unmarried, it would be possible, but the next step about is it possible being unmarried and with no father? So that was when I reached out to yourself.
And how did you find us?
I found you via the podcast. I'm just trying to remember
the same podcast that we're recording here today.
I love this podcast. I listened to a number of the episodes. So you have some episodes specifically about getting the birth certificate, and you did have an episode about getting the birth certificate as a single mother. So that was what made me, I knew you had the experience in that area, reach out to you. Coming across the podcast, I believe, was via a friend of mine who was also a single mother who gave birth via IVF a few years ago. She gave birth outside of the UAE.
What was your company like? You're obviously employed here. You've worked here for some time. Were they supportive?
They, as far as I'm aware, I'm assuming some of them knew, but I didn't bring it to their attention.
Right.
I didn't tell them about the pregnancy until quite later on, and I just told them I was pregnant without giving them the circumstances. So I didn't go into the actual details of.
There's no necessity that you should. I mean, no. It's just part of life. It's just an interesting point to make. What about health insurance?
But on that point about my company, I mean, it is. I do work for a global company with American headquarters, so I didn't think it would be an issue. Okay,
and health insurance was fine in your
Yeah,
case.
I have very good international health insurance, so I was covered during my pregnancy with my medical cover.
But in that regard, you were quite lucky, and this is why we ask these questions, because in a lot of people's cases, and we have had a number of women in very much similar situation as you who have reached out to us, and some of their perhaps biggest concerns at the at the early stages of their pregnancy is that what will the companies think? What will their employers think? Will they fire them? Even though I think by now most people know that the laws have changed, but do companies know that, or do companies take it kind of, have they adopted or adapted their mindset about this being an ordinary matter and not a criminal as it used to be? And so for a lot of clients who approach us, that's one of their biggest factors, is the companies, actually their employers, either threaten to terminate them or terminate them or question them or challenge them. And that's one part of the equation. And the related part is insurance, because those of us who live in the UAE know that in most people's cases, it's the company or employer that also sponsors the health insurance. And we've heard from both angles that it's the company that says, oh, no, your insurance will not cover you in these sort of circumstances because you are not married. And similarly, we also heard people's concerns that the insurance companies are saying, oh, no, we're not going to cover you because you're not married. And we, in fact, have researched this quite extensively on both fronts, from the legal standpoint and from contractual standpoint. So from a legal standpoint, there's nothing in the law, being the insurance law or any other relevant laws, for obvious reasons, that state that in order for you to benefit from your health insurance coverage, you need to be married. There's nothing in the law. And that's contrary to many of the representations we hear from employees and companies, representatives, and insurance companies representatives as well. So that's on the law side of things, but also on the contractual side of things in terms of your health insurance coverage itself, because it's a contract. We have yet to see a single contract that actually makes marriage and marriage certificate a requirement for a mother to benefit from health insurance. And yet that topic keeps coming up, and people are continuously being told that they will not be covered. Have you heard anything like this from?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting hearing you say that, because I have met a number of other women in the same situation as myself who have, who you mentioned earlier, I was lucky, who haven't been as lucky as me, and I can't comment on their work situations. None of them have mentioned that their work had any problem with it, but I do know that they weren't covered by their health insurance, and they have had to pay for their medical, their X-rays and all and the birth themselves.
And I'll tell you, from a legal and practical standpoint, my speculation is that they were not covered, not because they were actually not covered, but because insurance companies took that stance, we're not covering you. But had they pressed that, in most cases, if they had put the insurance companies to a task in terms of proving their case, they would have realized that there was nothing that prevented insurance companies from covering them. And in fact, they would have been covered. So it's a little bit more of perhaps a theoretical point, but to the point when you're saying they're not covered, it's not because the law says so or because the contracts provided for a lack of coverage, but rather because that's unfortunately insurance companies' mindset to this day, that somehow this marriage certificate is the requirement.
And after I heard everybody else's experience, I actually thought, oh, I'm lucky, and maybe my insurance company didn't realize I wasn't married and I got away with it, so that's interesting.
It's a good thing to point that out, though. I think that's a really important thing to say. Lindsay, let's talk about when you had your little boy. I don't want all the detail, obviously, but I hope everything was... I'm doing my man thing here, aren't I? Not too much. I hope everything went smoothly. Tell us about the hospital. There were no complications. Everything was fine?
So Andrew actually came unexpectedly early.
Right.
So he made a surprise appearance 2 weeks early. I delivered at Park View. Okay. Luckily, I made it to Parkview because, as I said, he was in a real hurry. It was a very short labour, and I think I only gave birth in the hospital because I happened to be there for a checkup at the time anyway. So,
good.
Yeah, interesting story.
Good.
And
I'll stop there.
And so let's kind of perhaps go back a little bit in terms of the hospital and how you chose the hospital. Did you ever experience any issues with the hospital itself in terms of requiring from you a copy of a marriage certificate or questioning you about that? or was it a fairly, by the time you delivered or you were preparing to deliver, it was a fairly smooth process in the hospital? It did not really, for the purposes of the hospital, it didn't really matter whether you had a marriage certificate or not, and therefore you would have had a file by that time that you showed up. You would have had a registered file and perhaps all the paperwork already submitted.
Yeah, actually, I do remember that when I spoke with you before, that was one of the things you'd advised, that if you are planning to give birth here, then maybe speak to the hospital before you give birth, give them the IVF documentation, make them aware of the situation. I remember with my doctor, she wasn't aware of anybody else giving birth in my situation here, so she was like, let me ask around, but she really didn't want me to raise to the hospital that it was an IVF pregnancy, because she said sometimes some insurance don't cover birth when it's an IVF pregnancy. So we didn't actually give the hospital we didn't tell them beforehand.
Okay, but the fact that they had a file on you and ultimately admitted you it meant that for their purposes they felt that the paperwork had been fulfilled.
Okay,
previously, in order for that paperwork to have been fulfilled, you would have needed to have a copy of your birth certificate or your marriage certificate as part of the file. So that's
okay,
just.
I was visiting the doctor. I know some people have their doctors in the hospital. Mine was at a separate clinic. So yeah, I'm assuming she booked me in with my file, which would have had, didn't have a father's name and any marriage certificate. I was never asked for that. No.
And on that point as well, as you prior to the delivery, as you were being seen by your OBGYN, had anybody asked you these questions? Did you ever feel uncomfortable about being seen without a husband by your side? Or
No, I really didn't. I felt completely comfortable. I felt able to, I don't know if confide's the right word, but to be very honest with my doctor about the situation. I didn't feel like I was going to there would be any repercussions of telling anybody. But nobody asked after that. It was never brought up as, I was never asked for the marriage certificate or any further information.
Okay, so now you're in the hospital. I delivered 2 kids in the UAE too, so I should speak a little bit from personal experience. And at that point, were you given any paperwork you needed to fill out that you remember clearly? As a sort of new mother at that point in time, I think you remember some things and other things are less so.
And I remember being very aware that I needed a birth notification before I that was essential for me to be able to get the birth certificate, was that I was going to need the birth notification. And that I needed a typed version. I remember seeing that. I think that was mentioned in your podcast as well. So I actually was, what's the word? Is it dispatched? I was allowed to leave the hospital on the Sunday, and there was no one around. There was no admin staff around. So I actually had to leave the hospital without anything, and they told me to come back for the birth notification. So I was a little bit worried at that stage, but I think I went back a couple of days later, and they had 3 copies of the birth notification that I had to write my son's full name, so his first name, middle name and last name, and sign, and I was able to take 2 copies. So I was relieved at that stage that I had that paperwork.
And perhaps you don't recall, but the form of this birth notification, and as you rightfully said, that's a step, birth notification, a step before birth certificate. But that form, among other things, calls for input on, the baby's name, the mother's full name, nationality of the mother, the father's full name, nationality of the father, and the nationality of the baby. And then also the names of the doctors and the nurses, and the date and the time when the baby was born. So that's sort of all the information that goes into this birth notification. So from what you recall, what did you put in for the baby, for the section that called for the father's details, and in terms of nationality, and how did you come up with the baby's name, and what was it?
Yeah, I remember writing my son's full name and signing. I don't recall if I feel like the names are the rest of the form was already typed out. So the father's name was either blank or crosses, or if it did need to be filled in, I would have filled in my name and left the father's name blank. That's.
And how did you name your child, and what nationality did you give him?
Okay, so I named him Andrew James Johnson, and he is British.
Okay. And then, so you walked out of the hospital with nothing on you, which in of itself was very brave of you, because we've seen many cases where people walk out of the hospital with nothing, and then at that point it is very difficult for them to actually go back and get some sort of a document that ultimately will allow them to apply for the birth certificate. So the fact that the hospital was already receptive to it, and as you said, perhaps even might have already populated or blanked out the father's name, and that basically means that they must have reviewed the file and saw that you were giving birth through IVF and such. So I think that's compared, Tim, to what we started when we started doing our first podcast on this topic. This is quite a huge progress.
It's huge distance in what was it, 2.5 years or something like that since we
right.
kind of first covered this topic. Lindsay, how was your stay at the hospital? Nobody asked you why there was no father. The checkout seems to me it was pretty smooth because you just left and then had to go back on the Monday morning kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Even at the time, as I mentioned, it was a checkup that I went in for, a kind of ad hoc checkup. Nobody asked me if my husband was on the way or anything. Nobody. Right. It was just a non-topic, to be honest. My stay, I was there for 2 nights. Everything went smoothly, and there was no issues with me leaving, apart from the fact that I didn't have the paperwork at that time.
Sure. I'm trying to sort of put myself in your shoes in a way, because I know I've had 2 children. Well, I've not had 2 children. My wife did the work. She did the heavy lifting for sure. But you're in having a baby. There's a certain stress and I guess relief that goes with that in a way as well. But also in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I have to get the birth notification, then I have to go and do the birth certificate as well. I'm trying to sort of get a picture of how you felt at that point.
Honestly, I really didn't expect to have any problems with the birth certificate, because at that stage, I had done my research. I had spoken to Ludmila. I had seen that the laws had changed. Right. I did know, it was legal to give birth unmarried. The main thing was I wasn't expecting Andrew to come along 2 weeks early. So, I was literally at the hospital with my phone, and that was it. I didn't even have my car. It was in the garage, So it was more of a... I wasn't expecting him, so it was more of, how am I going to get me and my baby home and and name him. I was expecting him to be a girl. I hadn't got a baby boy name ready, so yeah.
Oh, I did not know that bit. Had you not done the gender identification early on, or you were actually told that it was going to be a girl?
No, I was waiting for it.
Oh,
I wanted a surprise.
So,
wow. I didn't know what I was having until...
So you had a girl name.
And I had a girl's name ready. I only had 9 months to come up with a name, but I hadn't got round to the boy's name part.
I always think you can only name a child when you've seen it. I kind of think you got to think, right, okay, you are a Andrew. You are a, I don't know, Dana. You're whatever. That's my kind of thinking on it.
Yeah, I did have a list ready, but I remember just after birth, you're so... your hormones are all over the place, aren't you? I was very indecisive. It really, I guess when you said about how was I feeling, that was my main thing. What am I going to be?
I don't think that's unusual. You're not alone in that, for sure. So you give birth to Andrew. You kind of know that, your way around the process. You've had a chat with Ludmila. You have done some research. You expect... it's going to start, you have to start with the bureaucracy. What did you do next? I mean, you then have to go to a typing centre to apply for the birth certificate, I guess?
So I remember thinking, I need to be very clear about the steps, because once I've had my baby, it's going to be harder for me to work this out. So I had written down all of the steps. It was very, very clear from the podcast of what I needed to do to go and get the birth certificate myself. I probably didn't write them clear enough, because I actually went to the court first. But Andrew he wasn't even 3 weeks old. And I remember it was like, I'd only left the house a couple of times before that. So, and it was the first time I'd left, gone anywhere with him on my own. So it felt like a big deal to get him in the car, drive all the way over to the court. And I went to the wrong court. So when I got to the court, they sent me to a typing centre. And then when I got to the typing centre, they sent me to the court. but the different court. So, you know, Andrew's in and out the car at this stage. So then driving over to the, I can't even remember which court. Which court is it? The family court that I ended up at?
Yes.
The family court. Then when I arrived there, they tried to send me back to a typing centre. And by that point, I was, no, you know, I've been driving around for a few hours now with my son in and out the car, and I need somebody to help me now because I'd also heard somebody else say, when you go to the court, another mum who'd applied for her own birth certificate, she said when you go to the court, they'll try and send you to the typing centre and just be very adamant. So,
and just to give a little context to what you went through, it's quite different from the context for married parents or for married mothers, because for those who actually have that birth certificate, the whole process of the birth certificate is basically being managed through the hospital. So there's in fact a service, or there's an agency or a service that usually has a fairly, if not formal, but well-established relationship with the hospital. So they'll just come to you and say, here, do you want us to apply for birth certificate for you? You just fill out the paper, you just fill out whatever the few forms for them, you pay them money, and they do everything for you. So when you leave the hospital, then that's just to kind of give you a little bit of point of comparison, because what you went through is not an ordinary step for those who actually have a birth certificate, because for the rest, those with no birth certificate, the marriage certificate, and for them, it's all being managed through the hospital. Now that creates an impression for many people that it's the hospital that issues the birth certificate, but it is never the hospital. It's never been the hospital. It's just the process being managed through the hospital for those who are lucky enough to have the the marriage certificate. But it's actually issued by the Ministry of Health, the UAE Ministry of Health. But it's the hospital that kind of, or the agent that works with the hospital that sort of manages the whole process. So what you had to do was very different from all other cases, because you were a single mom with an unknown father. So that's just to kind of give context of, just having to go to the court is already a fairly different process from others. One, and two, just for context, and those who are listening perhaps to this without understanding the full meaning of typing center. Typing center is a little bit of a misnomer. It sounds like somebody you go place and they type for you, but in fact the typing center, as we refer to it in the UAE, is an offshoot from the court. So it's kind of like an outsource department of the courts. So whatever documents, whatever forms or applications that they so-called type for you, they submit, and that they have a direct link to the court. So it's not just a typing center, it's basically a part of the court system. So that's just kind of for clarification purposes for those who are listening and scratching their heads trying to understand what is a typing center. Like, I know how to type, I don't need to go to a typing center. So
and why are they using typewriters?
That was what I was aware of, that I needed, the hospital wasn't going to be able to get the birth certificate, so I needed the court to issue a letter to take to that the Ministry of Health would then use to issue the certificate. What wasn't clear for me was, do you go to the court, or is it the typing centre that requests the letter from the court? That and even with my visits, I wasn't.
Well, it might have actually been clear. It might have actually been clear to you if you had listened to our podcast with Tim, and we had covered this topic several times, because in fact, up until that point in time, that was the way things were done, even for mothers with unknown father, which we had represented a few of such clients, and we had covered and had the story shared on this very podcast, Tim, right? With mothers with unknown fathers, and we helped them issue birth certificates and so on and so forth. So the process actually that we covered, and that was perhaps is still populated in our podcast, that it worked at the time. So you'd actually go to the typing center, which you rightfully did, and then from there on, what you do is a sort of an informal, rather an administrative request for the typing center for order and petition, and then they send it to the court for basically you make a request for the court to issue a letter to the Ministry of Health, and the court says yes, and then you go with that letter to the Ministry of Health and you get your birth certificate. That's sort of how what we had covered, and so you were correct in how you approached this, because that's what we had done successfully before for multiple clients, for multiple mothers in very similar circumstances, even actually more perhaps more challenging circumstances, and we know it worked. Past tense. And so that's what also we covered in our podcast. And obviously you expected that was going to be a fairly smooth process. We expected for it to be a smooth process. This is why we had you, when you consulted with us, we gave you all the assurances that this is more of an administrative step at that point in time. You just need to go to typing center, and from there on it's just a matter of a few days and you'll have your birth certificate. That's sort of what you expected. That's what we expected for you. Yeah, and what did you ultimately encounter?
That was exactly what I expected. I mean, even saying, the process is very simple. You go to a type-in center, you get the letter. When you've just had a baby, everything feels a bit overwhelming. Even just trying to find the location, park, get in there, find out which desk do I go to. I thought that was going to be the most difficult part of it, to be honest. And when I arrived at each of the places and said I was there to get a birth certificate, the first thing they would ask is, where's the father? So I'd say there is no father, that's why I'm here to request the birth certificate. And they all said, oh, okay, yes, no problem. So I
go back somewhere else.
yeah, go back to the typing centre, back to the call. But when I said, please can you help me, I've already been to the typing centre, they were supportive and said, no worries, don't worry, we'll help you, we'll get the letter for you.
And did you ever
up until this stage, I was expecting it to be able to go smoothly. Just that I was going to be able to get the birth certificate eventually, should I say, one way or the other. Yeah.
Okay, so you're backwards and forwards to the court a few times. You made some applications with court reps. So I'm going to go to my notes here because I want to get this exactly right. February the 23rd, 2023, the court issues a document called an ishhad, which is a certification or an affidavit. And then in the ishhad, the court confirmed that you'd stated you'd given birth to a boy in Dubai on February the 3rd, 2023. And you declared to raise and supervise him and that you'd chosen the name Andrew for him. Am I right so far?
You are, but I didn't know that's what it said because it was in Arabic.
Okay, so even more curveballs going here. However, here's another curveball. You find in the same document the court declared that the court had given your son a different middle name and a different surname. Is that right?
Yes.
Which was
Andrew James Johnson.
Oh,
sorry.
No, that was the name you gave him, and the court gave your son the name
Andrew Daniel Alphonse.
Okay.
Is the name of the Danish father? Who's Alphonse?
I have no idea. I've never heard
Daniel?
that name
Who's
before
Daniel?
in my life. Obviously, the donor was anonymous. I don't know any Daniel Alphonse. It was a made-up name. And I didn't know. Like I said, they gave me a piece of paper with some short script on it in Arabic that I'd paid for. And then it was when I asked them, what does this say? They mentioned, you have guardianship of your son, and we've named, he's named Andrew, and the court has given him a middle and surname.
Right.
So you had chosen the name Andrew James Johnson, and the court had given him a name Andrew Daniel Alphonse.
Yes.
And what did you feel at the time?
I really did not know what to do. I just sat there saying, I was very shocked, really shocked. I was just trying to understand from them why, and saying, no, that's not his name. He needs to have my surname, and obviously not getting anywhere because they said that's the name that'd been allocated to him by the court.
And what did the court or court representative say? Did they explain how this new name came to be?
No, just that I wasn't allowed to he wasn't allowed to have my middle name and surname that I'd chosen for him, and that he had to have a middle name and surname chosen by the court.
And were you
I was on my own, so I had no one else to.
Wow. And were you aware of anybody else who might have been experiencing the same thing?
No, this was the first time I'd ever heard anything like this. That's why I say I was very shocked.
It's a real first. I mean, Ludmila, have you heard of anybody that this has happened to, that a child could be randomly named? Have you come across this before?
Not until Lindsay came into our world. No, and in fact, we knew the opposite. And as we have extensively covered on this very podcast, and as we've extensively and on multiple occasions helped our clients in real life to obtain birth certificates, not just in the Emirate of Dubai, but also in perhaps, at least arguably, some more conservative emirates like Abu Dhabi and even Fujairah. We have represented single mothers with unknown fathers, and help them get a birth certificate issued with only the mother's name on, with the name that the mothers had selected. Not only that, Tim, if you recall, and that's one of the podcasts we have, perhaps that's one of the more interesting ones that for the likes of Lindsay's story, and that's where there was an original name that the mother had given to the baby, because at the time it was still a crime to have a baby without a marriage certificate, and so she was in a panic, and she gave some name of somebody that I think actually was not alive at the time, supposed father, because she was in a panic and she was scared to lose her baby. She was scared of everything else, and then kind of in the meantime, while she was trying to get the birth certificate, the laws had changed, and it was no longer criminal to have a baby without a marriage certificate. So at that point in time, she obviously wanted to change the name. She no longer needed to be worried or scared about coming up with a supposed father somewhere. So she wanted to give her own name. And so we even applied. But the birth notification stated name number one. And then we applied through the court to actually change that name to her chosen name. So we had gone through this process. We know it. And we've had this person even appear on this podcast. So we know it worked. This is how it used to be. So your case was shocking to us. And I remember because you had come to us early on and this was going to be a no-brainer. And I still remember when you reached out and sort of in a panic. We were all panicking as well. I was like, what happened?
Well, yes, and I was aware of those other situations. And I thought, well, the name on the birth notification is the name I'm asking for, and I just thought I had done something wrong, that I had gone to the wrong place, or I just thought there's been a mistake here. I've because I had when I was finding out what the process was, there was obviously people were referring me to PROs that could do this for you. It felt like quite a lot of money after listening to your podcast, what felt like quite a simple process. So I'll save myself some money. I need that for the nappies, so I'll do this myself. So I just thought, maybe I was in the wrong place, or maybe I've said the wrong thing. There's something lost in translation here. And by this point, it was nearly 3:00. The court was about to close. I realised I wasn't going to get anywhere, so I left with that bit of paperwork, still like a bit shocked and worried, but really thinking it was a mistake that we could, that I could get fixed somehow.
And in fact, that's exactly what we felt as well. When you came to us, we just thought, well, surely, with all due respect, but Lindsay doesn't speak Arabic. She's a new mom. She had just delivered a baby. She's probably hormonal. She probably went to the wrong court, the wrong department, talked to the wrong person.
I'm not denying it.
All that. So we thought the same thing was surely something was lost in translation and somebody misunderstood and gave her the wrong document, or she just went to the wrong person. That was
so you're literally thinking at this point, everybody's thinking typing center couldn't type or something similar. It's as simple as that.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. But there was more to it than that.
Indeed. And so then one of the things that Lindsay did when she reached out to us, she obviously sent us the document that shocked her when it was first issued, which is this where the baby's name was something other than what she had chosen. And that document, we started researching and we realized, as you, Tim, rightfully said in your perfect Arabic, ishhad, and it's my perfect Arabic too. So it's the first time that we saw this document, and the translation from Arabic to English is certification or affidavit. We had never seen a document like that in the context of in particular in the context of a non-Muslim person. This is why early on I said your religion actually in this case does actually matter. We had once upon a time heard or sort of come across something similar in the context of a Muslim woman who was trying to have a baby without a marriage certificate. And so that word ishad, or just certificate or affidavit, came up in the context more of like Sharia law. So that we had kind of known very loosely, sort of in the back of our minds, but we had never actually seen a document issued in the context of a non-Muslim Western mother. So we were all kind of also scratching our heads thinking as a mistake, so she must have gone to the wrong court clerk or representative who was confused and thinking she was Muslim. And we have seen that as well sometimes, that a person is by mistake gets designated as a Muslim in the system, in let's say the official system, and as a result kind of everything else from there goes as if that person was Muslim, and i.e. the Sharia law would apply. So that was at that point when Lindsay came to us, we were thinking the same thing. It's just a mistake. Some typing center clerk at typing center made a mistake, and all we need to do is just correct it. And it will basically be sort of a fairly simple process. And just for those who are curious in terms of what this document specifically states, and it's, I guess, more or less sort of loose translation from Arabic, is like this: the court, so basically the court continues the baby's name in preparation for his identification documents, making his full name Andrew Daniel Alphonse, and we issue this ishad for it to be operated on this basis. So basically that's kind of what the document that Lindsay is referring to, what it stated. So it wasn't just it wasn't just kind of a form. It's actually an official document with fairly official and detailed language, if you will. So we realized it was not a mistake. And that the court ultimately specifically stated that the court is the one who had continued Andrew's name to be Daniel Alphonse.
I recall at this stage, this was when I was aware I would need to take this letter to the Ministry of Health to get the birth certificate, and obviously very conscious that I need to get Andrew's passport and his visa, because by a certain time I was then going to start facing overstay fines for him. But there was, I was thinking, do I go get the birth certificate and then fix it, or do I fix it now? So I'm glad I reached out at that stage
and you're right,
before I got the birth certificate issued.
And this is a very good point, because you're right. At that point in time, you have this official document from the court that's called ishad. With this document, you could have gone to the Ministry of Health, and they would have issued you a birth certificate with this name, Andrew Daniel Alphonse, and then from there on, you would have been able to apply for your for the passport, the baby's passport, and the baby's residency. So you're correct. So in terms of the process, it could have ended right there and then. So I guess the process could have been simple if you did not mind having your baby having somebody else's name.
I did have an issue with the surname not being the same as mine, though. I had a feeling this would lead to, first of all, that's not what I wanted, it's not what I chose, but even if I had accepted it, I think travelling as a single mother with a baby with a different surname to myself and no ability to get an NOC from the father to say that was okay, I thought was going to cause me problems.
Yes, and so I trust me, my kids obviously have their dad's name, and I have my own maiden name. So even me as a married woman with sort of a marriage certificate and all, I always think about that when I travel, because my kids have a very different name from my name, a very, very Slavic name. They have very sort of Latin names, and so it is a true consideration. And furthermore, there are certain countries where if you travel alone with your child, they require additional documents, like you said, an NOC from the father or some kind of an affidavit from the father. For instance, South Africa being one example. So it is important that the name matches, because it could be complicated even with all the documents in place.
It's already a complicated enough situation in a way, isn't it? So if you can make life easy, make it easy. Would be my kind of way of looking at this. So what, Ludmila, what do you do when your baby has a different name that you didn't allocate, for want of a better word?
Well, for us, drawing in our previous experience, when as I might add once again, a successful experience, we thought, okay, well, we can fix this by virtue of filing a request to the court that is administrative in nature, and that's called the order on petition.
Okay.
And we've covered this particular subject on this very podcast several times because although it sounds like you're still going through the court, it's still a request to the court, but it's not your typical substantive case where you have hearings and parties being served and submissions being made on both fronts. So it's order and petition is what's called in legal terms an administrative request to the court that's being done ex parte, which means without serving the other side. So it's and we have used this very tool to apply for birth certificates and even changing the name from the birth notification with the courts, and you submit it, and the whole definition of the order and petition is that the court must issue a decision within a day or two from the time that the file is accepted. And so that was our plan was, okay, this is going to be, that's not a big deal, we'll change this by filing this order and petition to the court and requesting for the court to change the name to Andrew James Johnson, as the mother had wanted to, and submitted on through Lindsay's court portal, and that was going to basically be kind of the end of it. So we expected, knowing that this is that here you don't necessarily you don't need to serve the other side because there is really kind of no other side. And submitted online, and we expected an answer within just a few days. And so by the time Lindsay came to us, and we had kind of this after you had gone back and forth between the different government departments, and after you came to us, and we had kind of studied this Ishhad idea and tried to figure out where that came from and whether there was a mistake or whether this was intentional and how to potentially correct it. So now we're talking about April. So. On April 24th, so this order on petition was finally registered. And so this is already how many months? I think 3-4 months into Andrew's birth. 3 months. So he's already 3 months old. He doesn't have a birth certificate yet. So we registered this order on petition. And then, as it was expected in cases of order on petition, within just a few days, the court responded. And so here in this case, it was April 26th, only 2 days later, the court responded and rejected, to our own surprise, rejected our order on petition and instructed us to file a substantive case. And a substantive case, a case for under full jurisdiction.
I can't imagine, Lindsay, how you're feeling at this point, but I want to understand what a substantive case is, and what the difference between an order on petition and a substantive case is. And unexpected is the word that comes to my mind.
I think it was unexpected to all fronts.
I can laugh now.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was unexpected for us because we have done this before successfully, and we just thought, okay, fine. Well, there's a mistake made somewhere. We can correct it. We know the tools. We've used them before successfully. It's not going to be a big deal.
I recall now that actually the order on petition was, from your earlier podcast, the process to apply for the birth certificate as a single mother. And by the time I had given birth to Andrew, the laws had changed again. And everyone was like, it's even easier for you to get the birth certificate now. Now you can just go to the typing centre or get the letter to take to the Ministry of Health without the order on petition. So when that didn't work, and I came back to Ludmila and they mentioned the order on petition, I was like, okay, this we're just reverting back to the other process. This will work.
And you're right, Lindsay. Actually, this is a good reminder that yes, order on petition previously worked before the laws on the issuance or registration of birth certificates in the UAE had changed. So in that case, we ultimately figured out that what we needed to do is we still needed to go to the court for single mothers with unknown fathers to apply for birth certificate, but we could do it through the order on petition, and that's kind of what we had discussed in our previous podcast. And then by the time you delivered, you're correct, that law on registration of birth certificates laws had changed, and it made it a lot, in the law that is, it made it a lot simpler to apply for birth certificates under your circumstances, which was basically a declaration from the mother. And you would do this declaration through a typing center. So going back to this typing center, so how it should have worked on the basis of this new, by the way, federal law. It's not just a Dubai law. It's a federal law on the registration of birth certificates. Lindsay should have just gone to the typing center, issued a declaration to the typing center, basically, and the declaration would have been, I'm the mother, this is my baby, and I name my baby such and such name. And then the typing center would have submitted the declaration to the court, and the court would have issued the letter to MOHAP, or the Ministry of Health. So that's sort of what we expected, but as Lindsay rightfully said, her process did not work. So we thought, okay, well, maybe since this is still a very new law, it was only issued in 2022, perhaps the authority is still learning the application of this law. And so let's kind of revert back to the previous method, which was slightly more involved by virtue of this order and petition, instead of just a simple declaration that should have been issued even through the notary public or the typing center. So we thought, okay, let's just go back and use the tool that we know for sure works, and that's the order and petition. But that, to our surprise, did not work for us, and the court rejected it.
Okay, so we go to a substantive order. How does that work?
Well, it's imagine. So we talked about order and petition, and even though it's a court process, but it's not really your court case. It's not fair to call order and petition a court case, because it's more just a request to the court, and there's not really back and forth kind of arguing and such. So substantive case is something very different. Substantive case is sort of what we all think of when you think, oh, there's a court case. You know, I'm filing a court case, or a court case has been filed against me. That's what a substantive case is. So now it's no longer ex parte, meaning that you need to serve the other side. So there is a claimant and there's a defendant, and the parties need to be served. In particular, the claimant needs to serve the defendant of this court case. So it's like a formal service of process, basically stating that I am suing you, because that's what a substantive court case is all about. And then you have court hearings, and parties are meant to make submissions and arguments against each other. So remember, a substantive case, you have a claimant and a defendant. If you just think about that alone, so you have basically parties on opposite sides, right? Because that's when you go to court case, when you have parties that are at odds with one another.
Sure. So you're trying to resolve difference, and the claimant is obviously Lindsay. Who's the defendant?
Yeah. Well, we had to scratch our head for a little while and figure out who the defendant should be. And by the way, this kind of took us back a little bit as well, because when the law had originally changed on this very topic in 2020, do you recall? Back then, when we were figuring out how to file these cases, we had gone through a whole list of parties we may potentially name in cases like this. So we thought about, what if we just name the court, what we name the Ministry of Health. That was back in 2020, right? So now we're in 2023, so we've moved on. But it kind of took us back down the memory lane, and we started thinking, well, who do we name now? So we kind of had to revisit our knowledge bank from back that time. And we ultimately thought, okay, so why don't we don't want to name any government officials or authorities, because that may take us into a different process of jurisdiction. And so we thought, okay, let's name Lindsay. So she'll be both the claimant and the defendant. And because, I mean, who else can you name a defendant? So it's like Lindsay basically against herself. So that's how we filed this. And that was basically kind of shortly thereafter we filed this kind of request to the court. And so Lindsay is suing Lindsay, and for ultimately requested the court to issue and correct the name of the baby and issue a letter to the Ministry of Health for the birth certificate. And that's basically what the difference between order and petition and a substantive case. I mean, the other differences obviously are the hearings and submissions and the time as well. And so in that case as well, then we filed the court actually scheduled, I think, a hearing 2 or 3 months out from the time we filed. And Well, that again, at this point, I think we're 4 months into the baby's birth, and so we asked the court to prepone the hearing, and which anyway, so which the court ultimately did. But before then, so our Lindsay's filing was a substantive case against herself was also rejected, and the court requested for us to actually name Andrew, her baby, as the defendant.
Right. Okay. I'm following this. I've just got to get this straight in my mind. So, let me just come to you for a second. This is 4 months down the road. Andrew is obviously 4 months old. How are you feeling at this juncture?
Yeah, frustrated, worried. I remember I was looking in parallel. What could the UK do for me? Is there any way I could get a birth certificate through them? The passport, I didn't want, or if I got the birth certificate in the wrong name, could I still get a passport in the name I chose to get his visa in the name I wanted? So I was trying to work out what my options were if this wasn't going to get resolved.
Well, I mean, established procedure to get a UK passport if you have a baby born here. I remember from doing it. My son's 20 when I first did it for him, but it was birth certificate from the UAE, which at that time there was no service. You had to do it, but that was your penalty as the father for not giving birth at the time, kind of thing. And then you go to the British Embassy and present documents, which you can't do.
Exactly. So I remember I would have been able to get a passport under like an emergency situation,
right.
But I would never have been able to get a birth certificate. I could register the birth in the UK, but because I didn't give birth there, I was never going to be able to get a UK birth certificate. So then I would have had a situation with a passport with one name and a birth certificate with another. I knew I was never going to get the visa, so I knew that wasn't an option. If I was either going to end up with a certificate with the wrong name, and then I'd have had to get a passport and a visa, everything else, all of his identification document in that name, or hold out and hope. My concern, I still remember deep down really having the confidence and the faith that we would get there. I just was worried about how long it was going to take, because at this point I can't travel. I was lucky that I did actually manage to get his health insurance, because most companies wouldn't actually have given Andrew any health insurance without any identification.
Right.
So I was facing long overstay fines for him. His health insurance was one thing, and I wasn't able to make any plans. And if anything had happened to my family, I wasn't able to just get on a plane. I felt quite trapped. And plus, it was coming up to summer during my maternity. I wasn't expecting to stay here as well. So it was very, kind of up in the air state. It was very difficult.
And on top of being a new mum and dealing with probably lack of sleep as well, I would guess, standard state of affairs. So Ludmila, you eventually, the court accepts your request to prepone the hearing. A new hearing date is set for June the 22nd.
Yes, that's from correct. That's from the original date that was set for August, and the substantive case was first registered in June, and June 1, and then the hearing was set for August, so it's 2 months out, and so that's when we requested for it to be preponed, and so the court thankfully gave us the June 22nd date as a new date, and it's just, if I may just kind of pause there for a second, it's going back to what Lindsay said about what her options were until then, or what she was considering, because we actually are also aware of some other mothers who have ended up going with whatever the birth certificate stated to their home country, and they're correcting the name or changing the name for their babies. But different countries, we've also heard cases like this, but different countries have different laws, and not all allow for the change of name. And even when you do have a change of name, it's still, you often have this sort of a whole chain of documents that you need to show. There's an original birth certificate, an amended birth certificate, and so on and so forth. So it gets very complicated. But we have heard of people considering or discussing that very option. But ultimately, I agree with Lindsay that and we had advised similar things to other clients before, that you better just fix it. If you can fix it at the outset, fix it at the outset, because at that point, after that, it'll be so much more complicated, and the baby may be stuck with these issues for the rest of their lives, trying to explain the original name of the birth certificate versus the amended name versus the passport and residence visa and so on and so forth.
That was also a concern of mine, that Andrew was going to grow up, find this out, and think I was hiding something from him, that he did actually have a dad out there called James Johnson somewhere, and I was making up a different story for him. So yeah, there was quite a lot to consider with what I went ahead. And I do remember we spoke, and I was very aware that once I got that UAE birth certificate issued, it was going to be impossible to change that, the actual UAE birth certificate name. So
no, I can understand that, because I mean that's a document for life, isn't it? In theory. So the court hearing is set to hear the substantive case, for Lindsay to appear. Andrew is the defendant.
Yes.
I'm right so far?
Yeah.
And is it online? Is it a personal? How does that work?
Right. So, but I do want to say one more thing, as Lindsay was talking about how she was, on the one hand, worried. On the other hand, she was confident that we would we would be able to sort it out for her. What she perhaps is not so aware of how we took it internally. We were so incredibly worried. I mean, literally our whole team and my colleague Hanan, who is the brains behind all of this, and she was the one who had been researching and figuring out how to connect all the dots. But we also took it so personally and to heart, her case. Well, she doesn't know about that. I mean, I don't know to what extent you do, but
I think Hanan kept it very hidden from me. I appreciate that. I think afterwards she kind of told me about some of the stories she'd gone through, and I was like, oh, I appreciate that. I didn't actually know all the problems she had faced as well. Behind all the other little avenues you'd looked at, should I say.
Yeah, and it's the problems, but also it's the emotional investment. We were so invested because it was so different, A, from what we knew and we had done, B, contrary to what the laws actually stated and what we expected, and then C, just at a human level, this is so difficult, we're only human here. So we really, really took her case to heart, all of us here, and we felt so emotional. And every time we had a setback like this, it really, really took us on an emotional roller coaster. And we shed tears here. I don't know how much Lindsay knows about this, but
she knows now.
in particular, Hanan, And we were determined, and we even took this case. Ultimately, we said, "Listen, Lindsay, we're not making money on this. We cannot charge you more for this because we cannot just justify it based on where you are and based on kind of where we are in terms of the legal." The challenges, because it shouldn't be this way. So just we'll do it for you just because we want to see this through from the intellectual.
I definitely felt that everybody was invested in this, and that you were all part of Andrew's family to get this.
Yes. We gave birth to him together. So he thought he only had one parent.
Oh,
He thought he only had one parent. Little does he
know. I needed you in the hospital at the time to come up with a name.
I'm fist pumping at the moment. Sisters. But it's hard not to get invested emotionally in something like this, isn't it? Because I'm getting emotionally invested in this, but you have this picture of the hard-headed lawyers just go to court, but it's not like that in this case.
It's not like that, and also because let's face it, I'm also a mom. I delivered two kids here, and I know what it's like, because ultimately this is not our home country, right? In the sense of we are not nationals or citizens of this country, which means that we depend on all sorts of documents, right? There's no pension system here. There's no Social Security. You can't ask the government to cover you for this and that. And you can't just live here without a passport, a birth certificate and a passport for decades, as you would in your home country, right? Because you don't have a birth certificate, you don't have a passport. I mean, how many Americans, for example, live their whole lives without having a passport issued? Sure. And that's not an event. But here, because it is, we're all residents here. I know what it's like, as Lindsay rightfully said. If you don't have that birth certificate, you don't have the passport. You don't have the passport. You don't have the residence. That means you cannot leave the country. Then, at some point in time, your health insurance, maternity insurance should cover the baby at least 3 months after birth. But what if every day that it takes beyond that point, you worry as well. Well, what about vaccines for the baby? Well, something, God forbid, were to happen to the baby. Is there medical coverage? Is there medical insurance? And we've had these cases as well from a lot of people that we cannot afford to go and get the baby vaccines because we're not covered by insurance. So these are very emotional and very personal issues, and they, they've worried us, and we were all very emotionally invested as well.
Okay, so now you have a hearing, and that's an online hearing. Am I right?
Yes. So at this point, and this was one of, and we've covered it on this podcast many times before, the UAE had really embraced the digital world to our delight as legal practitioners, because it made things a lot more efficient in terms of submitting documents, appearing in court in hearings, because including everything else, most of the court hearings were online, so which made it a lot more efficient. So in this particular hearing as well, by the way, when the court finally preponed, they had issued the date for the hearing, and in the documents themselves it said online hearing. But we thought, well, this would be better for Lindsay to actually be there in the courtroom, despite the fact that the documents themselves said that it was an online hearing. It's just that it's such a human story, and it's such a personal story. We just thought it would be better for Lindsay to be in the courtroom when this is happening. Irrespective of what the sort of, we figured, even if she means she's meant to appear in through an online system, but she's in the court physically, that would be better. So we recommended to her to go in person, and we said, well, Hanan offered to accompany her, and Hanan was there with her as well, and we also encouraged Lindsay. I guess encouraged. She's going to have to perhaps bring Andrew with her as well.
Had nobody to leave him with. There was no choice but to bring him anyway.
So then Lindsay came there with Andrew, and interestingly enough, the judge appeared online, and perhaps Lindsay can describe to us her experience a little better. So while we collectively appeared there in person, in fact, the judge was appearing online. So, I mean, Lindsay can perhaps describe how that was, but it was a little bit of kind of a surreal experience in the way we're sort of online, but we are kind of halfway physically somewhere present, and we this has become more or less kind of a sort of not an uncommon event in terms of court appearances, but for Lindsay showing up there with her baby, who is at this point only 4 months old.
I'm definitely glad that Hanan was there. I just was recalling when you said about even the online applications, poor Hanan messaging me at 10 o'clock at night asking for OTPs and that to register it. But she, Hanan at least had told me what to expect. We did have to wait a long time before we went into the court, and she had explained that the judge would not be in the room himself, and he would be online, because that was a bit. I walked into a room. I know there was two guys behind I don't want to say podium, but higher up setting.
A bench. Court bench.
And I was asked to approach like a small little camera, like you see at the airports. And I remember thinking they were going to take my picture for some documentation. So I'm smiling, and then suddenly the judge starts talking to me from it. So, I wasn't, clear on what the roles were of the two men in the room either. But I think they were. Documenting them or minuting what the judge was saying.
Yeah, and then the judge at that point asked you where the name Andrew Daniel Alphonse came from, right, and whether that's the name that you had chosen for the baby. And at that point, I guess you confirmed that was not your name, that you had not chosen, and you don't know how that name came to be. And you asked for the judge to change the name. And then I guess you can tell us better, but this is from our perspective. And the judge said that he will issue a decision on that same day. But
yes, the judge didn't actually say too much, to be honest. He did ask, exactly as you said, he asked me if that was a chosen name. It was more, I think he thought, or it felt like he thought I was there saying I've changed my mind about what I want to call him. I don't want to call him Andrew Daniel Alphonse anymore. I want to call him Andrew James Johnson. So once I explained that, no, Andrew James Johnson was always the name I wanted. I'd never requested Daniel Alphonse. He was meant, speaking in Arabic. The guys were typing that up, and then at the end he said, we'll issue a decision. I can't recall exactly what he said, but I remember feeling confident that the judge was okay with it. That he was.
I mean, you know what's been amazing to me is throughout the last, we've been talking for well over an hour, but you are so, the only word is chilled about this. And I guess it's easier to look back now that things are where they are, but you seem to be very, you've said a couple of times, I was confident it was going to go your way. You have a very positive attitude towards this, but it must have been
surprising for a Brit, isn't it?
Well, yes.
But no, I guess I was like, we'll get there in the end.
Yeah. But it must have been nerve-wracking being in front of the judge, even if it was just a camera and you thought they were taking your photo.
I was, by that point, I was confident in everything, but I must admit, about a week, 2 weeks before, I started to get really paranoid. I remember messaging because I was thinking, yes, we know about, single mums being unmarried, but what about the IVF part? I really started getting paranoid about, maybe there's going to be an issue with the fact that I did IVF, and maybe that's not legal. And even though I didn't do it in the country, maybe there's going to be a real problem around that. I became so paranoid. I was really like, why are we going through this exception? This different process. Why? Like, I still couldn't understand why Andrew had been given this random name. So because I didn't have that answer and I wasn't really sure what the problem was, I started to get paranoid.
Okay.
That, okay, I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to get deported. Maybe I'll get put in jail. I brought a friend just in case. I was really, really got paranoid at that point, yeah.
Are you paranoid? You thought that they would take your baby away and put you in jail?
I didn't think that, but I thought they might take me away. Yeah. And then I was, I'm single mum. What would they do with Andrew? I don't know.
It's
so that's the state in which she walked into this sort of courtroom, and the courtroom where you kind of have some real people, but not really, and you kind of have a judge, but not really.
Yeah,
but
the judge, we did have to wait quite a while. There's a number of cases before us. Yeah.
But how was the judge? Did you feel that the judge put you at ease a little bit, or made you nervous?
He was making, he was being very complimentary towards Andrew. I can't remember what he said exactly, but he was very because Andrew was jumping up and down on the bench in front of the camera, so being bounced up and down. So he's, was like something along the lines of him being a very cute baby, and as I said, asked if that was the name I wanted to give him. Once I explained the name I did want to give, it felt very like he was typing up, okay, issue a letter for the right name. That's how I felt when I left.
Okay, and you, when the judge was the judge clearly put you at ease and liked Andrew and liked the fact that you were there, and that must have been a relief.
Yeah, it was a relief. I remember expecting her nan or my friend to be allowed to come in with me, because I had a feeling it was going to be in Arabic and I wanted somebody that I knew to be able to translate to me, but that wasn't allowed. So that was my only thing, was like, there was a lot said that I didn't know.
Okay.
Yes. So at that point, but the judge did state, I'm not sure if you recall this, but that he will issue a decision on that same day. So Lindsay goes home with Andrew, and we go back into our office, and we start looking at the system, this is the blessings of the online systems, checking the system just compulsively, refreshing, but Hanan in particular. Okay, so when will the decision come forward? And then based on Lindsay's overall feedback about what the judge had said and the comments, and she clearly walked out of the courtroom a lot more at ease, which is a positive sign. So we were all kind of holding our fists and fingers crossed, so we're all very hopeful, and yet the decision is not coming. So I remember all day Hanan in particular was just losing her mind, obsessively refreshing the system, trying to see when the decision would come forward.
Yeah, I think it was her messaging me. Oh, still not heard yet, I'm checking.
And then later on that same day, that was June 22nd of 2023 at 10 p.m.
I remember it was very late, that was, to me, is late.
Yes, at 10 p.m. Hanan, after probably her finger was blistering at that point in time, trying to refresh the system. Finally at 10 p.m., the decision came out. And again, that's the blessing of the Dubai sort of online system and this digital embrace for government services. So we could do that. You didn't have to wait till the next day to go to the court and get the copy of the decision. It's, these, as decisions were coming forward, they're being populated, however the system works. But yes, at 10 p.m. the decision became available. And then we, so the decision stated, one is that same document, Ishhad, as we recall, that actually, so the court issued a decision or an order canceling the Ishhad. Okay, so canceling, not just amending it, but canceling it, and stating that that Andrew's name is now Andrew James Johnson, as named by his mother. So that's basically the decision. But think about how huge that is, because remember, we talked about this whole idea of Ishhad, that we didn't expect it. I mean, Ishhad is, we've seen the term come up in the context of Sharia law, application of Sharia law, which does not apply to Lindsay. So, and then as we were trying to figure out what had happened to Lindsay, we were all scratching our heads and kind of questioning, and this is why we thought this was a mistake. It's a mistake. Ishhad should not be issued here. But we were being told by the same court representatives and that, this is the right document. So having then seen the court's, this is judge's decision expressly canceling the Ishhad gave us tremendous, confidence in ourselves once again that all along our understanding of the law was correct. So it wasn't just that the judge said we're amending the Ishhad to the name that the mother had chosen. No. The court said we are canceling Ishhad altogether, because the idea of Ishhad said that the court names a child, right? And that usually happens basically, and that's perhaps a little bit of a legal nuance, but Ishhad is issued in cases typically where the parents are unknown, and this is where the court would act as a guardian and then name the child. So seeing the judge expressly canceling the Ishhad just gave us huge sense of relief and justification, sense of justification and kind of confirmation that our understanding and our interpretation of the law was correct.
And it's really interesting to me that this is what the judge said in terms of the name, Andrew's name. He stated, look, Andrew James Johnson is a name more favourable to the child, as it is his way of identifying with his mother and her family, and that the surname may carry nobility and history that benefits him, essentially completely overturning what had been written in the Ishhad.
Exactly. On the one hand, overturning. On the other hand, confirming all the concerns and all sort of thought process that we discussed here. And for Lindsay in particular, in her circumstances, being a single mom and having to travel with her child for the rest of his life. The continuity, obviously, of the family history and the family name is so much more important in her circumstances. So having this judge not only expressly cancel Ishhad, but also expressly confirming that the baby's name will be as the mother had chosen for him, Andrew James Johnson, and that the reasoning is because it's a fairly substantive decision and reasoning. That's because this name, having the mother's choice of name, is much more beneficial for the baby, much more favorable, because it would allow him and the mother to obviously have a much more predictable and life on the one hand, but also allow for the baby. I mean, the words such as the surname may carry nobility and history that benefits him. I mean, think about it. It's pretty interesting, because ultimately the judge is saying, well, who knows? Maybe Lindsay is some kind of royalty here for all we know. And so if the baby has some kind of noble blood in him, he should benefit from it. So it's not just okay, we authorize the change of name. It's a fairly, in legal terms, a substantive and nuanced and well-reasoned decision.
Well, it is, and it's also the judge essentially saying, Lindsay, this little boy needs a sense of self, and recognising that. Is that how that made you feel?
Yes, that up until this point, I'd started to feel like the identity, his own identity, wasn't considered that important. And that actually maybe there's a way around. It's just a name, and I can, accept it, which I was very uncomfortable with. So having that kind of reinforcing what we've been thinking and saying all along was Yeah, it was definitely reassuring.
So it's 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
You get that news. Hopefully you got a good night's sleep that night. I don't know. 4-month-old baby.
They've
Questionable.
all blurned into one, I'm sure.
Yeah. So Ludmila, landmark decision. The judge rules as you could only have hoped he would rule. Birth certificate on the way the next day. Is that what happened?
Well, so we thought, but not
That's
quite.
not what happened.
No, it's not what happened.
Okay.
No,
That would have been too easy.
Indeed, yes, that would not have been the full story.
Right.
So the next day we thought, okay, well, let's strike the iron while it's hot, and then take this court letter and go to the Ministry of Health and have them issue the birth certificate as per the court order. So I remember, it's not just a letter; it's a court decision, it's a court order, it's a judgment. So with this judgment at hand, Hanan ran to Mohap, or the Ministry of Health,
and she's running because we're approaching Eid.
Oh, that's right.
The following week.
That's right. That was June 23rd. You're correct. Yes. So she runs, just trying to kind of seize the moment and apply for Andrew's birth certificate. But no. Once again, we encountered another little stumbling block, another surprise. So the Ministry of Health informed us that Andrew's birth certificate application now will have to be approved by the Ministry of Health Certificate Committee. So, and that's for their sign off and approval on the issuance of the birth certificate. And we have seen this before, in particular in the case of single mothers, where you don't just go to normally with I guess both parents present. You go to the Ministry of Health, you submit the application, and they issue a birth certificate right there on the spot. In those cases of single mothers, we've had we knew that there was a step where the committee would meet, and then the committee would ultimately approve, and that we've discussed this in previous podcasts as well. So the committee would finally issue that decision. So, but that practice, once again, we thought had been a thing of the past, and so we didn't expect for it, because again, the laws in terms of the issuance of the birth certificates had changed by this time. So the laws do not provide for any kind of meeting of the committee and the approval required from the committee. We have a court judgment, and that's it. And court judgment issues ultimately an order to the Ministry of Health stating, please issue the birth certificate for this name. So that was a surprise to us as well. It wasn't just like the regular step where the Ministry of Health would issue the birth certificate right there on the spot, which is what we expected. Then now we needed to wait for the meeting of the committee.
We just missed a committee, hadn't we? And are they every 2 weeks?
Yes. And so the committee meets twice a month, and so we had just missed it.
Okay.
Yes. So anyway, but at that point, all we could do is just leave the letter with them, the judgment with them, and wait for the committee to meet and issue the approval. And hopefully 2 weeks later, we would be hearing back from them with already a birth certificate.
Right. So, how long did it take for you to get a positive decision? Because I'm looking at both of you thinking, this still didn't run smoothly, did it?
No.
Okay.
So 2 weeks into it, when the committee finally met, we heard back, and they said basically they needed additional documents. So in other words, the committee had not given us their approval and sign off for the issuance of the birth certificate. In fact, they requested that we obtain a letter from the court confirming that this June 22nd judgment, which we were trying to get the birth certificate issued, was final and enforceable. So that's another surprise. Especially because the new birth certificate law does not require for the meeting of the committee, and B, does not really kind of anticipate for the committee to have conditions attached to the issuance of this sort of court decision. And certainly C, I don't know where this came from, that the confirmation that the judgment of the court was final and enforceable.
Okay, so you have to get a letter, and that's got to be just a technicality. Surely that's just go to the court. You've got the decision, you get the letter, it gets signed, and then you go back. Is it?
So we thought, but no. Once again, that wasn't.
This is turning into a Netflix show.
Yes. So with basically with these new instructions at hand, we went back to the court, and that was around July 27th, and we went to the court to request this letter. And since, in this particular case, remember the letter was supposed to state that this is final and it's enforceable, i.e. it's not challenged. Well, but since in this case the claimant is the mother and the defendant is the baby, who is going to challenge the decision? So obviously it is final and enforceable. So it just kind of the whole premise of the instructions were somewhat difficult to reconcile from a logical standpoint. So we liaised with the Dubai courts to obtain this certificate confirming that the judgment is final and is enforceable. However, that too was not the end of the road, and the Dubai courts admin team basically kept rejecting our requests multiple times. So we kept requesting the sort of certification this judgment is final and enforceable, and we just kept getting rejection after rejection after rejection, and without any explanation. And this is where perhaps you kind of, in a way, is a little bit of a drawback in terms of this online system, because all you get the decisions very quickly published, which is great, except that in many cases just rejected, and there's nothing else. There's no reasoning behind it. And these rejections, because what we're asking for is more of an administrative document stating that the judgment is final. So it's actually being issued not by the judge, but by the admin team. So the admin representatives of the court. So that's why, and all they need to say, they don't need to issue a judgment explaining why they're requesting this and what the process is. They just basically can say reject. And so we just kept getting, and we were trying to figure out what we were doing wrong, what were we sort of not submitting, and ultimately I think we could not even went to the court to try to understand what was going on. And so ultimately the Dubai courts stated that the certificate cannot be issued, this certificate of finality cannot be issued because the defendant was not served of the judgment. And the defendant in this case is who? Andrew. Yes. So
I think I'd been protected from this part. I think I know there was a lot of, this was the back and forth that I wasn't aware of,
Okay.
Yes. So that's there's a lot more that went on here. Yes. So
I'm trying to work out how you would serve a 4 or 5 month old baby with it. It doesn't work.
Exactly. And so we attempted to submit this multiple sort of requests to the court to obtain this certificate without basically ticking this box that yes, the defendant or Andrew had been served. And also because there is, from a legal standpoint, if we had affected the service, and by just ticking that box, yes, the service had been done, then we would have to wait for another 30 days from the day of service for the judgment to become final. So it's a bit of a legal nuance, and this is why we're trying to avoid having to tick this, what may otherwise appear a very just administrative, a formal requirement of just ticking the box, yes, the service has been affected. But had we ticked that box, we would have had to wait for another 30 days to effectively for this judgment to become final by virtue of not being contested or challenged. And obviously these additional 30 days would have been detrimental for Andrew and Lindsay, because by this time it had already been 5 months from the time that Andrew had been born. So at this point he still doesn't have a birth certificate, he doesn't have a passport, he doesn't have residency, he's overstaying. Even 2 days would have been too long, but 30 days were not kind of acceptable to us.
Right. So time for a new approach, I suppose. What did you do?
Yes, and this is, again, flip-flopping in terms of the benefits and sometimes perhaps more limited drawbacks of the online system, more benefits, way more benefits than sort of shortcomings. But so there is a system, again, this Hanan is the brainchild. This is her brainchild. I mean, really, she had to put on a lot of kind of thinking and creative hat. In this case, to try to figure out innovative and kind of out-of-the-box ways of continuing to challenge what seemed like sort of status quo. And so she decided that let's request, because we couldn't get through to the judge. All we're getting blocked by the admin team, who just kept rejecting our request. So we thought, okay, let's make a request on the system to meet the judge. And so there is that kind of request you can make on the online system. It's just basically to meet the judge. And we in requesting this, we stated that this was very important for the baby, and in the timing is of the issue of the essence. And we also stated that it was unnecessary for us to serve Andrew of the judgment and then wait for 30 days, since that's the birth certificate is for him. So that's kind of where you see really the peculiarity, if you will, of having this claimant and defendant case, right? Which is what we started with. This is why having to file a substantive case where you have a claimant and defendant, this is how these issues can come to be. So the reason you usually have this requirement of certificate of finality is just to make sure that the judgment is not appealable. But that usually happens when you have your sides on two parties on the opposite side of the table, right? Conflicting parties, and so the other defendant would, or whatever the party would not challenge the judgment. But here the so-called defendant is the baby for whom we're trying to obtain the birth certificate. So anyway, so that's we explain all that to the judge in our request to meet the judge. And anyway, and then we also stated that in any event the judge met the baby, which is why, going back to our original or kind of earlier perhaps advice and ultimately decisions of for Lindsay to bring Andrew to the court and actually take Andrew to sort of so-called meet the judge, albeit by video camera. And the judge had met Andrew, had made these comments about Andrew being cute and made some jokes and so on and so forth. So we kind of justified in this sort of request to meet the judge is that, hey, this is unnecessary, this is for Andrew, this is for his benefit, and in any event, you've met him, you know what this case is all about. So we made the request, and the request was finally approved for us to meet the judge. And then on July 27th, the court issued basically the judgment. And so in this, it's interesting. It's not like we met the judge, actually. We didn't have to meet the judge. It's just this in making this request, and this is Hanan's creativity and ingenuity at play, is in making this request to meet the judge, we basically built our case, right? So we said, because otherwise there isn't, how do you actually engage with the judge when you already have a decision, when you have a final decision and you don't have an appeal? How do you actually engage with the judge, right? At that point, you only engage with the admin team, which is what we had been engaging with and kind of hitting a wall a bit with. And so this is Hanan's creative approach. Okay, let's meet the judge, and ultimately, by virtue of this request, plead or make our pleading, make our submission of basically explaining why having to serve Andrew is not necessary, and why it's actually more beneficial for the court to waive this requirement of the final of the service of process and such, and that we just basically, and therefore the importance for the court to issue this finality certificate for the purposes of issuance of the birth certificate. So so we made that request to meet the judge, and then in response, the court issued the letter that we so badly required, and then in this letter, the court stated, yes, the judgment is final and enforceable. And that was July 29th, 2023.
Wow. Okay. Because there's so much more to this. So I can follow Hanan's logic. Hanan is tremendous, by the way, but her logic that this is not a case where a simple case of you stole 5,000 dirhams, you have to pay me 5,000 dirhams. There's a whole lot more going on in a case like this.
Indeed, but in a way, this case should not have had a claimant and a defendant.
And shouldn't have gone that far, but you can see, you can follow Hanan's train of thought, can't you?
Yes, and so we needed to be very creative, and truly she had some very novel thoughts and approaches to this, which ultimately have brought us this successful resolution of the case, but I'm not sure how much of it actually Lindsay was.
I was going to say, how much did Lindsay actually know here? I mean, in the nicest possible way, it's probably good to keep some of this from you.
Yeah, well, I think Hanan definitely kept her frustrations away from me. I know there was about, like Ludmila was saying about Hanan going to the court. She told me this later afterwards, that she was turning up there personally, and I think she didn't want to worry me because at one point I still wasn't clear, right, on why I'd got this random name, and I told you about my paranoia earlier. So at one point I thought, is this never going to be solved because they need to keep it open in case they think there's a potential father out there that might come forward to appeal this, and that's what this is about, and therefore how long is this going to go on? So by this point I think I was not resigned to it, but I wasn't expecting any answers anytime soon at this stage.
Okay.
I hadn't given up, I'm not saying that, but
No, but you get accustomed to being in process, don't you? Yeah. I can understand that. Yeah. So the court issues the letter. The judgment is final. It's enforceable. Ludmila's thinking, yes. What? Where do you go now?
Okay, so Hanan runs back with this letter to the Ministry of Health, gives the letter of finality along with the original judgment. And lo and behold, on August 3rd of 2023, Mohab finally issues a birth certificate with the baby being named Andrew James Johnson as chosen by his mother. Voila!
6 months to the day Andrew was born.
Wow. 6
months later.
Exactly. Yes. So February 3rd to August 3rd.
Yeah.
And you have that piece of paper in your hand.
Hanan did.
Well, Hanan.
That's true.
It doesn't matter who's got it, you got it.
Yes.
How did you feel?
Oh, I remember I was at work. This is how long, I was back at work. I remember being at my desk and not quite believing it, to be honest. But like I said, I wasn't expecting that to be the end. You've heard the story. I thought there must be another but or if or something else that we need, some other thing we have to go through. So I was very relieved, shocked, very overwhelmed. I remember being very, very very, very thankful to Nan. I know she did a lot for this.
Yeah. I can imagine she did.
I have to tell you, we screamed here. We screamed, we cried, we hugged, because for us it was we gave birth to this baby, a legal birth. So Lindsay did the physical birth, we gave the legal birth. It truly felt
it definitely felt like a family affair.
Yes.
So from a legal standpoint, what does this mean? Because this is, we've been talking about a substantive case, but this is a substantial turn of events from a legal perspective, surely.
Yes, indeed. And so after all this, we went back and kind of reassessed what had happened and tried to piece together and explain from a legal standpoint and from a professional standpoint how we came to be, how this practice came to be, which was a departure from what we had done before, and also a departure from what we believed the law provided for, the new law. And so in legal terms, there are what we were able to piece together is that you have a number of legal authorities that the various authorities in this particular case relied on. So at a high level, there is the UAE, the federal law on the issuance of the birth certificate. That's the law that changed in 2022, and that's the law that ultimately was supposed to make the process of applying for birth certificates a lot simpler. And that's law number 10 of 2022, and that's regulating registration of birth and deaths. I know it sounds a little grim, but that's ultimately the federal law that establishes the practice for issuing of birth certificates and death certificates. And that was one law that, as you recall, Tim, when the substantive law decriminalizing having babies out of wedlock changed, but the reason for the process for the birth certificate had not changed was because that administrative law on the issuance of the birth certificates had not changed. So the substantive law in 2020 changed, but the administrative law on how do you apply and issue a birth certificate had not changed. And we talked talked about it in many different podcasts after that. But finally, in 2022, by law number 10, that law had finally changed. And now it kind of brought in line the change in the substantive law with the regulatory administrative law of the actual issuance of a document, right, to support the birth. And as per this federal law, all that is required, which is what we expected, was a declaration from the mother that she is the mother and that's how she wants to name the baby and the nationality of the baby. And that is the process that we expected for Lindsay to have gone to the typing center, for example, and just make this, or it could even be done through the notary public as per the language of the law, that is. And just because all it requires is a declaration from the mother. And so with this declaration, she should have just submitted a request to the court. The court would have issued the letter to the ministry. And then the ministry would then issue, without the meeting of the committee, would issue the birth certificate. So that's how the law is drafted. And ultimately, that's sort of that's our interpretation. That's what law provides for, and that's what we anticipated. So, and that's why we were so shocked and confused about what was going on in Lindsay's case, and we're trying from a professional and intellectual standpoint to understand what was causing a different application of this law. And what we ultimately figured out is that in Dubai, so this is the federal law we talked about, right? But in Dubai, there is what is called the Dubai courts has its own personal status. It's a personal status guide. And that's a personal status guide that it uses for purposes of personal status matters, such as divorces, custody, determining how to, for example, calculate alimony and how to divide custody and so on and so forth. So it's called a guide. Okay, so Dubai courts had issued its own guide, which we knew about. And then also in 2021, this particular guide became official by virtue of an actual decision, or like a law, if you will, that adopted this guide as a kind of regulatory guide as basic and by virtue of adopting it, made it into law. So it started out as just a guide issued by the court, and then there was a decision issued, and it's decision number 3 of 2021 regarding adopting the regulatory guide for personal status matters in Dubai courts. And that's basically the decision that ultimately made this guide law, because a guide, by virtue of its name, usually is just that. It's just a guide. It's not an enforceable source of authority. But by virtue of the 2021 decision, it became the law. And in this particular guide, and there's Article 63 ultimately that sets out this concept of ishhad. And it's, as per this Article 63, basically it calls for the court in issuing decisions in the case of where you have an unknown father. It says actually unknown parents or unknown father. It says the court has to basically issue the name for a child and declare his date of birth, confirm his place of birth, and confirm his religion. And that document is called ishhad. So that's how we kind of retrospectively figured out how we came to be, how this concept of ishhad came to be. However, what's interesting is that this very Article 63 in the Dubai Personal Status Guide that defines ishhad and ultimately gives the court the authority to issue the birth certificate and give the baby the name, also states at the end of the paragraph that taking into account the legislation in force in this regard, i.e. this is what the court does, provided that there is no other laws that, for example, set out a different procedure. But remember, taking into account the other laws, that's the federal law. So we have a law that, at least from a legal standpoint, supersedes more limited law, because this is a Dubai court's practice guide, and this is the federal law that sets out a very different protocol for issuing the birth certificate. So this is why we didn't expect for this personal status guide from the Dubai courts to supersede the federal law that sets out a very different process of just a pure declaration versus an ishhad certificate. So all in all, that's how we were able to piece together what had happened. It's perhaps less interesting for Lindsay, but from the intellectual standpoint, and this is why we took her cause so personally, because for us, these things, from a legal standpoint, did not quite sort of come together in the way that they logically are supposed to come together. And so this is how we were able to come to sort of reverse engineer, if you will, how Lindsay and why Lindsay had gone through what it had gone. But ultimately, if you do the 180, by virtue of the court canceling Ishhad, it had confirmed our original interpretation of the federal law, which does not require Ishhad in the case of the case like Lindsay's. So I dare say we were vindicated by the court's ultimate decision in our belief and conviction that the federal law should prevail. And as per the federal law, all that needs to be done is a declaration by the mother, and then the sort of a fairly administrative decision from the court, and then Mohap, the Ministry of Health, is supposed to issue this letter without requiring any additional documents, without requiring committee, without requiring certificates of any finality or enforceability. But that's more from a legal standpoint, how we finally at least reconciled in our own minds how Lindsay ended up in this kind of a legal debacle and sort of legal enigma, if you will, which we finally resolved in our own minds. And at least now we know where that practice came from and how to potentially address it. Though I would like to believe that as time goes on and more of these cases see the light of day, that the authorities will start applying the federal law perhaps more closely to its original purpose.
I mean, to be fair, I mean, I was going to ask you, is this not more indicative of the fact that we have a really rapidly evolving jurisdiction here in Dubai, in the UAE? That's got to be part of this, surely.
For sure, and we've seen this before, Tim, and we've covered this before. For example, when the originally out of wedlock, so to speak, births were decriminalized, so the law had changed, but the authorities, when every time we would approach at that time, and the police and prosecution and even hospitals, Ministry of Health, at that point in time, they were still. It took some time for the authorities, or perhaps for the law to trickle down to different levels of society, including different authorities, in understanding how to apply this law. But one thing actually that reminds me, Tim, is that one thing we did hear from the Ministry of Health when we told them this should not be required. We should not be a committee. We should not have required this sort of certificate because of this new law. What we had learned from them is at that point in time they had not yet received a mandate from the authorities that have authority over them, that regulate them, that this new law is in effect, and therefore their practice had to be amended. So yes, so even though perhaps at an intellectual standpoint, people, representatives of the authorities would know that the law had changed, but as an official authority, they too have their own protocol in terms of where they draw their mandate and their instructions. And at that point in time, they had not yet been given an instruction that the protocols and the procedures had changed, and there was a different, perhaps a more simplified process. So as we go through the process, hopefully 1 year forward, I would hope that the information and knowledge continues to spread, and that and next time around, it's going to be a much more predictable and streamlined and more administrative process for mothers like in Lindsay's position to apply for birth certificates without having to go through the ordeal that she and we had gone through.
So there's some inconsistency, and I guess that there are different legal systems within the Emirates, aren't there? So that's... It's not an easy explanation, but it is by way of explanation.
Well, interesting you said that, and that just reminded me of something else, since you're talking about inconsistencies even amongst the Emirates, because shortly before we applied for Lindsay's, or tried to apply for Lindsay's birth certificate, we had actually assisted a client who was based in Abu Dhabi, an Abu Dhabi resident, also a non-Muslim woman, single woman who had a baby through IVF, and I'm not sure if Laura remembered or if we had consulted her at that point in time, but we had actually also helped her issue her birth certificate through the Abu Dhabi Judicial Department, ADJD, and it was just a matter, she kind of faced a little bit of stumbling blocks, sort of small pebbles here and there on her path, as well being kind of directed in very similar fashion to Lindsay's by the representatives, different authorities about filling out the wrong forms. But once we pointed her, okay, there's a special form in ADJD, the Abu Dhabi Judicial Department, there's a special form for birth certificate issuance for babies with unknown father. So there's a special form, and so we submitted this form online, and we received a birth certificate within just a few days. So in her case, so we know we've done it, we've been there.
Yeah, it's a very simple form. I even tried to.
Right. Oh, that's right. I think didn't we even try it for you? That's right. That reminded me. We tried
applied to Abu Dhabi as well. Yeah.
You're right. So we tried to do that for Lindsay as well, because we knew that there was a simple process in a different emirate, and we applied, but because we just thought, okay, let's try it.
I hadn't given birth in Abu Dhabi, it wasn't possible. But
so we needed some sort of a connection to Abu Dhabi, and there wasn't any. She was not a resident, and she had not given birth in Abu Dhabi. So they said, well, this is not the right jurisdiction. But you're right. We tried that for you as well because of it. So you're right, Tim. It's even amongst the emirates, the procedure. For the time being, there's a bit of differences, but I would hope that as we go through the process and time, things will become a lot more reconciled.
Well, let's hope so. Ludmila, from your standpoint, what's the moral of the story? Because I mean, I'm losing grammar and vocabulary. It's just wow.
I think moral of the story is it's a multidimensional perseverance. And just being kind of creative, inventive in the application and also implementation of what we of laws and legal practice, right? So we are. Perhaps it's our own fault, our own weakness that we're just a team of fairly young, and I put myself in that group of fairly young souls. Yes, thank you. Of legal minds, and we care. First of all, we're interested in the law. We're interested in the legal profession. We're interested in the legal industry. We're actually sincerely interested, and we're also very much invested and intellectually interested in the development of the legal framework and system in this country. Because as we've said this many times on the podcast, it's like living in the history in the making. It's very exciting because the country is making tremendous leaps forward, and it's changing for the better quite rapidly, its laws. But obviously there will be some lag time between the time the legislation changes and it trickles down in practice. So we know that. We're realistic about it. It's very exciting on the one hand. But on the other hand, it just kind of, it's a reminder that as times change, as we evolve, we need to continue to stay on our toes. We need to continue to evolve as legal practitioners. And also because we take these kinds of matters to heart ourselves, when you take a matter to heart, you have all sorts of creative juices flowing through your blood all of a sudden. You don't even know how. You wake up in the middle of the night and think, oh, I've got a great idea. And perhaps I'd like to think that sort of also what helped us collectively come up with these different solutions and ultimately you have the result that we did.
Yeah, I did want to add that, I mean, this story isn't unique to me. I mentioned before that when I first got this shad, I was looking around what my options were, and I did reach out on various groups and found out other women in my position that had also faced this, gone to get the birth certificate and being issued an ishad with a random name, and unfortunately gone ahead and got the birth certificate in the wrong name as well. They weren't as fortunate as I was to have found Ludmila in the team, and you've heard that story. There is no way I'd have been able to navigate that on my own. I mentioned quite a few times I was always confident that it was going to go the right way eventually, and I think that's because her nan and the team were always able to translate that to me that made sense in what the rest of it felt crazy to me, but they were able to make some sense of it for me, and I would not have known where to have gone next. All these as Ludmila was saying, the creative ideas, I wouldn't have been able to do it without them.
No, I mean I was gonna say to you there, last word really to you, because fortunately, I mean it's resolved now. You have a birth certificate, but above anything else, you've got your little boy. But it's all come good.
Exactly. I can look back at that as a distant memory. It was. We've been laughing throughout this podcast. Obviously, we weren't laughing at the time.
No,
it was very stressful at the time, and I think we're laughing so we don't cry now. But it wasn't a very emotional time. But even now, I'm like, okay, we got there, we did it. It's an achievement. It didn't feel. I look back and don't think.
It
I'm
really
pleased
is.
we got the outcome we did.
And the other side of it as well, I think, is if your story can help somebody in a similar situation.
Exactly, that's why I'm here.
That's why. Well, look, thank you for joining us. Lindsay, all the best with Andrew as well.
Thank you.
No more
Thank you for
Alphonse.
having
No more.
We'll never get to the bottom of that one, I guess. But that's another episode of Logical. Birth certificate issuance in Dubai, and a real experience shared as well. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Lindsay, for coming again.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. All the best, very best to both of you and to Andrew. And thanks as ever to our legal expert, managing partner here at Yamalova and Plethka, Ludmila Yamalova. Thank you for your expertise, for sharing your knowledge, and for sharing the story.
And thank you, Tim, for you so capably moderating this discussion and getting this, help us get the story out there in the way that hopefully will not just be beneficial, but also interesting to others. So always much appreciate your expertise and your capable moderation in these kinds of matters.
You can find us at LY Law, social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn. All the podcasts that we do are free at lylawyers.com. And if you'd like a legal question answered in an episode of Logical, or if you would like to talk to a qualified UE experienced legal professional, click contact at lylawyers.com.